Hello, my name is Tej van Pettinger from Economics Help, and today we're going to look at policies to reduce unemployment. And there are two main types of policies, either demand side to increase aggregate demand and create jobs for higher economic growth, and the second broad policy is supply side policies to make labour markets more efficient and to tackle structural, frictional and classical unemployment. If we start with demand-side policies, these are policies that you would consider in a recession when unemployment has risen due to a lack of demand. In a recession, firms reduce output or close down, so they make workers redundant. So the policy is simply to try to increase economic growth so that firms create jobs. The first policy could be monetary policy, and the Bank of England or central bank could cut interest rates. This leads to lower borrowing costs and encourages consumers and business to invest and spend. And in theory, lower interest rates should lead to higher growth, and therefore firms need to employ more people. Now, interestingly, this happened in 2009 when the financial crisis hit very hard and central banks reduced interest rates close to zero. So you would expect that to solve unemployment. But in 2009, despite interest rates of close to zero, it wasn't enough because people just couldn't borrow from banks. Banks didn't have money, or the confidence was very low. So in this case, some economists say we need to use fiscal policy. And this is a classical Keynesian response to a recession. And basically the argument is that if there is a fall in private sector spending and deficiency of demand, then to solve unemployment, or at least reduce it, the government should be willing to borrow more. And the government borrows from a private sector who aren't spending. And through higher government spending, you can create public works, which leads to the employment of people. And examples of this include Roosevelt's New Deal in the early 1930s and the US response to the financial crisis in 2009, where there was an element of expansionary fiscal policy, higher government spending and lower taxes. And in theory, again, this should increase demand, reduce unemployment, but it is politically difficult because it will lead to higher government borrowing. And some economists are not convinced that higher borrowing will always lead to higher job creation in the long term. Now, moving on to supply side policies, this is for when the economy may be at full employment, positive economic growth, but there's still structural and frictional unemployment. And the first policy, which is fairly uncontroversial, is spending on education and training. Because a lot of unemployment in the modern economy is when workers don't have the right skills to be able to take a job. So, for example, if a coal mines close down, you have the relatively low-skilled coal miners. They're unable to take jobs in IT, computers, because they just don't have the right skills for that. So if a government is able to provide these unemployed workers with new training, new skills, then they will become more flexible, more able to take the new kind of jobs that are being created. Now, it's not a panacea because the government may not know which type of training needs doing. Workers may not be willing to go on courses, or they may not be aware of it. But I think there's across the spectrum of economists, there is an appreciation that education and training can help to reduce structural unemployment. And it's increasingly important because of the fast-changing nature of the economy. Now, another policy, which was perhaps more popular a few decades ago in the 70s or 80s, is to reduce the power of trade unions, reduce minimum wages. This is an argument of classical economists that they say that unemployment can be caused by wages being too high. A trade union or minimum wage pushes wages above the equilibrium, creating less demand for workers. Now, if this is the case, then reducing trade union power, reducing minimum wages can cause more employment. Now, in practice, I think that such a policy today would have very little effect because, firstly, trade unions are not very powerful anymore. I don't think they're pushing wages above the equilibrium. And also there's an element of firms having monopoly power, the ability to set wages below the equilibrium. So when you see a rise in minimum wages, there's a lot of studies that show that this doesn't actually cause any unemployment. Another fairly controversial policy could be import tariffs. Now, this was used under Trump, but American workers are losing their jobs to cheap Chinese imports. Therefore, tariffs on Chinese imports can protect American workers. And in theory, some workers may benefit. If you have tariffs against cheap Chinese steel, then US steel workers may keep their job, but otherwise they would have lost. However, this ignores what else might be happening, because if the US put tariffs, China may retaliate, and this may hurt US exports. So you protect jobs in the steel industry, but you may lose them elsewhere. And also there's no guarantee that even tariffs will protect American steel jobs if the industry is in long-term decline. Another very important policy is more flexible labour markets. Some economists look at unemployment rates in Europe and America and the UK and say that higher rates of unemployment in Europe are due to higher rates of structural unemployment, and they argue that the more labour market regulations in Europe are part of the reason. So, for example, if you reduce maximum working weeks, reduce labour protection, make it easier to hire and fire workers, then the argument is that firms will be more willing to employ them in the first place. And it is true to some extent that American labour markets are more flexible and unemployment is lower than Europe. However, it is worth bearing in mind that when you reduce labour market regulations, workers can lead to more part-time work, more temporary work, lower wages. And so there is a trade-off. And if you have very flexible labour markets, labour morale may decrease. And if you see in that graph here that the US unemployment rate is quite low, but if you include all the what's called marginally attached, people who are part-time, doing less hours than they would like, then actually the rate is higher. So it's not quite as rosy as it may look just from looking at unemployment stats. Another controversial policy for reducing unemployment could be reducing unemployment benefits. The argument is that if benefits are too generous, it encourages people to stay unemployed. Now, there may have been some cases, perhaps I think in Germany for a while, unemployment benefits were very generous. But generally speaking, I think if you cut unemployment benefits, there will be no discernible reduction in unemployment, because the vast majority of unemployed are not staying on benefits because it's a kind of cushy job. You know, in the UK, in the US, and increasingly in Europe, unemployment benefits are really lower than what you would get from doing a job. And also, I think that most people would prefer to have the pride and self-respect of working. Another controversial policy to reduce unemployment is a maximum working week. The argument is that if people work less, then firms will have to employ more people. And France tried this with a maximum working week of 35 hours. And the hope was that this would reduce France's high unemployment. But unfortunately, it didn't really occur. because if workers have to work less hours, it doesn't mean that a firm will be able to employ other workers to do the same job. They may lack the skills, or the firm may not have confidence in that worker. So just to summarize, reducing unemployment isn't straightforward. But if you have a recession, then most economists, though not all, will say that an element of demand-side policies can help to reduce it, especially if a recession is very prolonged, like the Great Depression or the financial crisis. But apart from the demand-side unemployment, then to reduce for what we might call the natural rate of unemployment, the underlying rate, you need a variety of supply-side policies. And there's no magic bullet, but certainly better education and training, more flexible labour markets, and better information about jobs can go some way to reducing the natural rate. Thank you for watching.